Okay, good morning, guys. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you back to our Great Questions class, and I hope everybody has had a good week. Today, as you can see with your notes, we have a lot of ground to cover, and that's because today's great question, as you're going to see, is both deep and wide, and here it is. How does Christianity relate to the other religions of the world? So we're going to go around the world today and take on this vast subject. So hang with me with the notes, because we're going to be moving pretty quick as we move through this. We're going to jump around, so you're just going to have to watch real carefully in your notes as we move through this material. But I want to start today with some popular ideas when it comes to different religions. I call the following, that we're going to look at the following three statements, kind of modern, simplistic summaries of religion that makes the general populace feel good, because it doesn't create static and it doesn't create differences. It just kind of helps us all get along together. The question is, are they accurate? Here are the three statements. First, all religions are revelations of the same God. This last week I picked up a newspaper, and in it was an article on the Baha'i faith, which is one of the fastest growing religions of the world, some 5 million followers right now. And one of their central themes is as following. This is their quote out of the newspaper article. The Baha'i faith says the sacred text across religions, including the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, and the Bhagavad Gita, are part of the same revelation of the same God. So in other words, all these holy books that we have from all time, in their minds, are all part of the same revelation striving towards the same God. And then it goes on to say, just as different intervals throughout history with leaders like Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster, and Muhammad, they all represent the same God. Now that feels good because we all get along in that statement, doesn't it? The problem is that the idea of God in all those religions differ in dramatic ways. And some of those religions I just quoted, they're not just one God, they're multiple gods. In others, there are no gods. In others, I'm God. So the question is all that the same? Can all that get along together? That's the question we want to look at today. Here's a second, what I call simplistic summary. All religions teach a similar moral code and are thus the same at the core. In other words, we're really all after the same thing, and that is for man to be good and get along and build a better society. And guys, it is true that if you look at most of the religions of the world, when you get down to some of the practical implications of those religions, there are some common moral truths. Most religions are against murder, stealing, greed of some kind. Most religions are for the family, so there is some common ground. But again, the problem is when you begin to investigate those religions, you discover that the moral codes of most religions are just a small part of those religions. Most religions in their teaching, what they really teach are concepts that are much bigger than the moral code, and they contradict one another. I like what Ravi Zacharias says. He says this. He says, right here, he says, many say religions are fundamentally the same and only superficially different. But the truth is, religions are fundamentally different and only superficially the same. And some of those little practical tidbits that fall out of each religion, though there is some common ground between them, it doesn't make up for some of the vast differences in what they actually teach as far as doctrine. And then a third simplistic summary would be this: all religions are equally valid paths to God. That's a really popular one. Mahatma Gandhi said this: religions are simply different roads converging to the same point. And yet, most religions, in fact, the two greatest religions, Christianity and Islam, are exclusive religions. they discount everybody else. I mean, Jesus himself did that in John 14:6. He said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And it's hard to fit in Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam into that kind of statement the same way if you're saying there's no God but Allah. It's hard to fit in Jesus into that kind of statement. So they, in a sense, they nullify the religions outside themselves because of their exclusivity. So having said that, let's look at what some of the great religions of history are. We could look at tons of different religions. I'm just going to pick the 7 greatest religions. And that's what we're going to cover here today. So on your outline is the religions listed. Let's just put the followers, the number of followers in each of those religions. For instance, Christianity, which is the largest religion, has 2.2 billion followers. Then there's Hinduism, which has 1 billion. And the answer is 1 billion. Buddhism, who has their founder, Siddhartha Gautama, has 487 million. Judaism, which is the smallest religion, Christianity is the greatest religion, but it only has 14 million followers today in Judaism. Islam, with Muhammad, has 1.6 billion followers at present, and with the not conversion rate of new followers around the world with Islam, but just simply reproduction. Muslim families are far more reproductive than most families, and the Christian West is in a negative population replenishment direction. And so according to most demographics, by 2070, Islam will be the world's largest religion as far as numbers go, current rate. Mormonism with Joseph Smith has 14.8 million people. And then non-religious atheist, which is a belief system. I mean, it is a religion in its own sense, which is one of the fastest growing religions, has 1 billion followers. Now, if we were to put those numbers and those religions up on a historical plane, just to give you an idea of when these religions came about, we go back to the oldest religions, and those 2 religions are Hinduism and Judaism. It's interesting too, Hinduism, which doesn't have a founder per se, it just kind of, we'll look at this in just a minute, which kind of grew out of the Eastern culture and is really a bunch of multi-religions. It's more polytheistic with many gods. In fact, this may shock you, but in Hinduism there are 330 million gods. I don't know how they came up with that number. I just read it, and I had to question it, but it is just a vastly polytheistic religion. Because, but most of ancient history, if you think about it, most of ancient history is polytheistic. It's kind of the central theme of ancient history. You look at the Greeks and their gods, the Romans and their gods, the ones we know from Western civilization. There are temples everywhere to all kinds of different gods. When you have Paul making his great statement in Athens on Mars Hill, you know, his whole thing is about all these different gods that you see all around the city of Athens, and then he presents what he thinks is the true God, that is Jesus. But being monotheistic was a very unusual thing in ancient history. And Judaism is the birthplace of monotheism, where suddenly God is just one God. There is no other. 2000 BC. Then Buddhism comes along in 530 BC. Then in 33 AD, of course, you've got Christianity. In 622, 600 years after the birth of Christianity, Islam comes on the scene. And as we'll see in a moment, Islam draws a lot from Christianity and Judaism. The ideas that are in those 2 religions really helps formulate the basic outline of Islam. And then Mormonism comes along in 1830, although it's a major religion today in America and in the world, and it brings us up to where we are now. So these put the great religions we're going to look at. We're going to look at each one of those, move through each one of those in the next few moments and get a feel for what they are, how they present themselves. But one of the things I want you to see is 3 of the great religions, Christianity, Islam, and Mormonism, they're monotheistic, draw their roots off Judaism. And in Buddhism, which Buddha finally came out of Hinduism with their many gods, Buddhism presents a kind of a one-way path to enlightenment, not to a personal God, but to enlightenment, as we'll see. So that's where we are in the great religion. So we're going to take each one of those, starting with Hinduism, and I'll just move through the notes and give you kind of summaries, and then we'll compare each of these religions to Christianity. So first of all, Hinduism, the world's oldest religion with no known founder. It has all kinds of different sacred texts, but Hinduism, and you can maybe surprise your friends with this, but Hinduism is not one religion. Hinduism is a term the British, when they occupied India, gave to it. It really could be called Hinduisms because it's a vast variety of different religions. They all have some similar basic concepts, but it's just a vast variety of different religions. And many of those, if you're a Hindu, when you look at the different branches of Hinduism, some of those branches will be totally contradictory ideas to the other branches. Some of what they believe about the path to Brahma, the ultimate reality, are different paths that contradict each other. But in the Hindu religion, that's not a problem that they contradict. The goal is to get out of this endless cycle of reincarnation to this ultimate absolute. And whatever path you choose that works for you is okay. That's how they think. That's why that idea that's birthed in Hinduism is popular in American culture today, because it feels good. You can bring that over, and so you've got the Muslim and the Christian, well, whatever way works for you. Okay? I just want you to know that idea comes out of Hinduism. That any way that works for you is a good way. It's just what's important is for your eternal soul, and everybody on earth has an eternal soul that's stuck in suffering. If we can get your eternal soul out of this endless cycle of suffering to this ultimate absolute, whatever way gets you there and works for you is good. Okay? Now, look at beliefs. There's some basic concepts, though, with those 330 million gods and those different branches that compete and contradict one another. There are some basic concepts that pull them all together. One is the belief in samsara, which is reincarnation. In other words, we all begin in the same place, the place of suffering, this life, and we're stuck on a wheel. Okay? It's a treadmill. It's going around and around. And based on your karma, good or bad, based on how well you lived, what you believed, the devotion you had, you're looking, as any Hindu is trying to look, is to get off the wheel. What you want to do is finally break free and get out of that endless cycle of suffering into what they call is moksha, which is liberation. And what are you looking to be liberated from? This life. And what are you looking forward to? And that is to merge. Everybody look at me. This is real important because it's a different concept that you have to wrap your mind around. You're trying to break free from this conscious existence into Brahma, which is an impersonal, unconscious existence. And that's what eternity is for you. The illustration that's given often for the goal of a Hindu, same way with a Buddhist, it's like a drop of water, okay, that by itself is an individual element. It's like a drop of water struggling to get back to the ocean. And when it finally does, and that drop of water hits the ocean, it dissolves, it becomes one with the ocean, and personal consciousness ceases to exist, and you become part of a greater whole. You made it. Now, because I'm a lineal thinking, Western, culturally shaped person, the idea of struggling my whole life to get out of this endless cycle where in this life I'm a man, the next life I'm an animal, the next life I'm a ghost, and then I come back as a man and I'm working, and I finally, through my commitment to good karma, finally break free, that the ultimate goal of all of that is to finally dissolve and disappear in consciousness into this ultimate impersonal force. For whatever reason, that doesn't excite me. Okay? But I say that because you've got millions and millions of people on that wheel looking for that destiny. Now, there's 3 paths to liberation. They're listed in your notes. We won't go through them. In Hinduism, there's the path of good works. I just simply earn my way to Brahma, that ultimate absolute. The path of knowledge, I think right, and that liberates me. And then there's the path of what they call passionate devotion, where I use gods, not gods as we think of God as the ultimate reality, but gods that are these different beings that are helpers to get me to that ultimate absolute. But my devotion to them and using their help, they can help usher me to Brahma. Okay? So let's compare Hinduism with Christianity here on the screen for just a moment and use some of the cardinal doctrines in all those religions. First of all, most Hindus do not believe in a personal God. They believe in some gods, but they're not gods as we believe in gods. What God is to a Hindu is this formless, abstract, eternal force without attributes. It was in the beginning, and your goal is to get back to that like a drop of water getting back to the ocean. In Hinduism, Jesus is just simply a helper God, but they don't believe that Jesus was truly God. Man's nature is divine. It's not sinful. It's part of that ultimate absolute that for some reason has been separated from it but is working its way back to it. Sin in Hinduism is an illusion. It's not something that has to be forgiven. Living better, knowing more, being more passionate, that's what's important to get your way to this ultimate salvation. And then salvation itself, it comes by each person just earning. It's a works-based religion based on works, knowledge, and passion. You earn your way. You discipline yourself in a better karma, good works, to get your way to this ultimate destination. So that's Hinduism. Now, out of Hinduism comes Buddhism, because Buddha, Siddhartha, Buddha was a Hindu, and evidently that didn't satisfy his life. He felt it was, I guess, too abstract in some ways. So he reduces all these different ways to one way. It's one-way Buddha. Okay? And he got there when he committed himself to 40 days of meditation. And as he meditated and thought about it, at the end of those 40 days, according to Buddha, he found life's meaning. And he experienced this, or he experienced the highest degree of consciousness. He, in a sense, became enlightened in that moment. That's what Buddha is, the enlightened one. He went from Siddhartha to the Buddha. And being the enlightened one, now he could show other people the path to this nirvana, which is in Hinduism, Brahma. It's this ultimate destination that Buddhists are shooting for. So he rejected his Hindu background, but he did continue to accept reincarnation. So in Buddhism, incarnation is a big feature. And again, in your endless cycle of lives relived, your goal is to work your way off the wheel. It's just in Hinduism, there are all kinds of ways to do it. In Buddhism, there's only one way, and that brings us to the beliefs, because you can see that. In Buddhism, it's a very clear structure. You have what he calls the Four Noble Truths, and I'll just read briefly down through these, but the Four Noble Truths are simply this: all of life is suffering. All of suffering is the result of being selfish or having selfish desire. The cure for selfish desire is good works, otherwise you're in this endless reincarnation. And when you rid yourself of these selfish desires, by following Buddha's strict eightfold path to enlightenment, then you can break off of that wheel into nirvana or enlightenment, or the ultimate enlightenment. And if you look at Buddha's eightfold path to enlightenment, if you look at it, it is a strict, disciplined life. You see it there? The eightfold path, right understanding, right thinking, right speech, right action, right livelihood, so on and so forth. Everything's got to be right. And it's hard. A couple of years ago, I was in China, going through China, different cities, Xi'an, Shanghai, and Beijing. And one of the things they have these great plays that tourists like me can go to. And they really are spectacular plays of dance and music and acrobatics and stuff like that. But it was funny, every one that we went to is teaching Buddhism. And I can still remember going, and it was the life of a young man who is going to reach enlightenment. And so he starts out, and he's a guy who is good looking, he's wealthy, he's living his life kind of for himself, and it becomes miserable. And then he meets an enlightened one who begins to talk to him about this new path. And so he begins to discipline himself, and you go through these musical numbers where he's getting stricter and stricter over his life, and he finally gets exhausted with it and has an affair and sexually destroys his journey. And then he goes through this repentance, and you see all the agony of him trying to get his life back right because everything is self-effort. And then he gets a little older, and towards the end of his life, he finally gets to enlightenment, and you see him lift off the stage and into this nirvanic state. It's a great production. But boy, I just remember when I watched it, we were walking out and just talking about, boy, that is a hard life. To constantly be ridding yourself of any desire, because the goal is to end desire. And I remember we went to a Buddhist temple, and for a few minutes they ran us out, but they let us walk inside, and all these young men in their orange robes, are in there chanting and that kind of thing. And they've had to remove themselves from the world to rid themselves of desire. The goal is to get rid of all of that so that you can enter this enlightened state, part of which can happen at the beginning of life on earth, like Buddha did, but ultimately to rid yourself completely of consciousness and desire and thought and disappear into this enlightened ultimate reality. Now, what's interesting is at some point in Buddha's life, they ask him what nirvana was. Because you're whipping yourself and you're disciplining yourself to get there, so what is it? And Buddha said he didn't know. He could only tell you how to get there. And I thought, again, maybe this is just my Western mindset, but again, I just thought, that becoming a destination point where I sit there and I try to rid myself of all desire so that at the end, as I enter this enlightened state, human existence as I've known it ends and I cease to exist. I just join the greater enlightenment, but consciousness and thought and desire completely is obliterated, and I just become, remember, Om, one. That's the goal. I have to admit, I don't quite get that, but I better understand what the religion's trying to teach. But the goal is an impersonal existence, a joining with the ultimate reality by myself being liberated from my reality. That's Buddhism. So how does Buddhism compare with Christianity? Well, Buddhism denies the existence of a supreme personal God. Now remember, when somebody tells you that all religions are the same, they believe in the same God, I mean, right here, do you see the contradictory nature of that? You got to, most of the great religions, Islam and Christianity, have gods, have a God. But here with Buddhism, there is no God. There's just an impersonal absolute. Buddhists identify Jesus as a good teacher. Of course, Jesus came later with Christianity, but when Buddhists have to engage who Jesus was, they make him just a good teacher. Salvation in Buddhism, the only person who can save you is you. That's Buddhism. Sin in Buddhism is just simply selfish desire. And that selfish desire has to be eradicated, but it can only be eradicated by you. You can't call on anybody for help. It's only eradicated by your own self-effort, following that eightfold path of enlightenment that Buddha lays down strictly for Buddhists. It's not Hinduism with all those different ways. It's just this way. This is the only way, the eightfold path to enlightenment. And then when it comes to eternity, notice it says there is no heaven or hell in Buddhism. There's also no hope for conscious life after death. Nirvana is the loss of one's individual self into a greater impersonal reality. Human existence ends in nirvana. You cease to exist. Which then leads us to Judaism, the smallest of the world's religions. But Judaism is important because it's the mother of the great world religions, Christianity and Islam. But in Judaism, you have monotheism, or the beginning of monotheism in 2000 BC. And because of that, Jews, are committed to one God and to moral living more than anything else. I pointed out here that one of the reasons even today Jews are so committed to causes like St. Jude's and stuff like that is because living morally before God is central to Jews. They don't think as much about eternity, whether you're saved or not saved. They just assume that if you believe in God and live morally, you'll be accepted by God. So doing good deeds is very important in Judaism. Look at their beliefs. Number 2, Jews fall into 2 categories today. Religious Jews who believe in God and the Jewish traditions that they practice in a variety of ways. And then the growing secular Jews who, some of which reject the view of God entirely. Some still believe in God generally, but God is it's just a catchphrase, so to speak. It's not a way of life. If you go to Israel, like I did just recently, you feel that in the Jewish culture, because all over Israel there are a lot of secular Jews running the nation and who still admire and participate in Jewish traditions, but the Jewish religion, the strict Jewish religion, they're not much interested in. And then you have these small but very influential Jewish Orthodox Jews living in Israel who practice ancient Judaism by the letter of the law. And so if you're in one of those towns and the sun goes down on Friday and stuff like that, and you drive through, they're going to stone you because they practice the Jewish law. Everything stops on the Sabbath. And they're the ones with the curls and the hats and all that. They're just by the book, strict, influential, highly disciplined Orthodox Jews. And so you see both the religious Jews and the secular Jews in the state of Israel. The religious Jews fall into 4 categories. I'll just mention just so you know, because that would be true even of Little Rock, Arkansas. These 4 categories. You have the Orthodox Jews who follow the strict law of Moses and the traditions of Judaism. You have the conservative Jews who they loosely follow the law, but they keep the Jewish traditions. The Jewish culture is very important to them, so they are very strict in keeping their bloodline close together and their culture close together. You have the Reform Jews, who we would call liberals today. They are not very religious necessarily. They believe more in reason than they do in God. They'll still keep some of the traditions and holy days, again, because culturally they still value their culture as Jews. And then you have, lastly, Messianic Jews, which is kind of a growing group, a small group, but those are Jews who have trusted in Jesus as their Messiah. And I've put in your notes here, it's estimated that more Jews have put their trust in Jesus as Messiah in the last 50 years than in the last 20 centuries. Messianic Jews are very aggressive evangelistically. We've got Jews for Jesus and others who really aggressively evangelize their Jewish brothers. But those are the four groups. Now, how do they compare to Christianity? I think this is fairly obvious, but we'll still look at it. First of all, Jews believe in one supreme God. They're the ultimate monotheist. But they reject Christians and our view of God because they see us as polytheist. With our Trinity of God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, to them that's polytheism, that's blasphemy. That's three gods, not one God. They are strict, one God only. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, Deuteronomy 6, is one God, just one. That's it. Anything that hints at more than that, that's like the pagan religions, and that's where Christianity would be included. As far as man, Jews believe that man is born innocent, not sinful, and therefore in this life is free to choose between good and evil. Jews, of course, would reject Jesus as Messiah. To the Jews, Jesus didn't fulfill what Messiah was going to come. Now, if you look in the Old Testament, one of the things that confused the Jews is you see a conquering Messiah pictured in the prophets and a suffering Messiah. And somehow that didn't all fit together. In fact, the suffering part of Messiah, a lot of Jews consider that's just the nation of Israel. We suffer. We're waiting for a conquering Messiah. And Jesus comes along and stirred up a lot of things that he possibly could be the Christ, but because he didn't ultimately end up ushering in the kingdom as the Messiah, the King of Israel, Jews felt like, well, he can't be the Messiah because he's not the conquering Messiah. And so they're still waiting for that. Whereas as Christians, we say, well, why they got confused is because Jesus was both. He was the suffering Messiah at his first coming. He'll be the conquering Messiah at his second coming. When it comes to salvation, within Judaism, it's just up to every person to save themselves. They don't think of their Judaism as the only way to God. They look at everybody as having a path to God. But to believe in God, you've got to believe in the one true God and then live a good life. And then ultimately, when your life is over, you entrust yourself to God to decide if it was good enough. Okay? But the key is, it's on you to save yourself through believing in God and good works. And eternity for Jews, they believe in the resurrection of the body. Jews do not put a heavy emphasis on being saved. For whatever reason, it's just within Christianity, that's a big deal for us. But for Jews, it's not that big a deal. They know there's going to be a resurrection, and they know really all they can do is not worry about that other than just believe in God and live a good life. But at the end, everybody's going to be resurrected and then judged according to how you've lived and believed, and then sentenced to heaven or hell based on that. And that's why eternity is the resurrection of the body and immortality. So that's Judaism. Now let's go to the biggest religion other than Christianity, and that's Islam, the one that, you know, is kind of front and center every day in our paper and on the news because of the movement of Islam, both radical and just general in the world today. Let me just kind of tell the story a little bit about Muhammad. Muhammad grew up in Mecca. And in his early days, he was a trader, a young trader, who worked in the caravan trade that would go back from Arabia, back into Palestine and Syria, back and forth between those countries in the trading business. And because of that, he was exposed to a lot of religion. He was exposed, because remember, it's around 580, 90 AD. Christianity is flourishing. The Romans have taken over Israel. So the Romans control the Holy Land. Christianity is everywhere. So he would hear a lot about Christianity. He would interact with some of his Jewish business counterparts. They would talk to him about Judaism. Then he would go back to Arabia, which is now Saudi Arabia, which was highly polytheist. There were hundreds of gods, and there was a lot of in those days, a lot of dumbing down of all religions. In Arabia, Christianity, Judaism, polytheism can all meld together, and people were religious, but people were also living very immoral lives. It was a very secular religious world. And Muhammad was exposed to all that as he was growing up. And so he picked up concepts of law, of God, of second coming, of judgment, of Jesus. And as he thought about that all, he became disturbed, especially with polytheism. He married a very wealthy widow who provided him plenty of time to think about these things. He began to meditate day and night. He would leave for long periods of time and go into the wilderness and meditate in a cave. And in one of those excursions, he had what he said was an encounter with Gabriel, the same angel that Mary encountered when she was told that she was going to give birth to Jesus as a virgin. So you see him, again, there's a lot of using terms and individuals and stuff that bring forth concepts that he learned in those years as a trader. But Gabriel appeared to him and began to give him a new prophetic message. And he was disturbed by that, talked to his wife about that. She encouraged him that that wasn't just illusion, that was reality, that God was selecting him as somebody special, as a prophet. He would go back and have more revelations, and after a while, he would bring scribes who he would take the revelations he was experiencing from Gabriel and dictate what he was hearing to these scribes to write down, because Muhammad couldn't read or write. So he just dictated these, and that dictation became the Quran, the holy book of Muslims. And by the way, Muslims believe every word that's in the Quran cannot be changed. It's got to be exact, because what is in the Quran is exactly the way Gabriel transcribed it or gave it to Muhammad, and Muhammad gave it so they couldn't change any line. It's not been changed since the day Gabriel gave it to Muhammad in a cave. And that's their holy book. That's their Bible. So he took that and he began to develop some followers in Arabia and preach this new monotheism. And as you can imagine, in Mecca, which was the center of polytheism, that didn't go over too well. I mean, you know how emotional and given to violence Arab culture is, just generally, by what we experience, even with each other. And so it wasn't long before some of these Arab tribes set out to kill Muhammad and his followers for their heretical teaching. But he had developed quite a following, and they fought back, and so a war ensued. We won't go through all that. There are a lot of things that happened during that war, but eventually Muhammad and his armies won out, and he became kind of the central religious power in Arabia. He went back into Mecca, this center of polytheism. He cleansed it from all the gods. I think there were some, I've got it in the notes somewhere, there were 360 different gods. He cleaned up Arabia. Arabia went from being polytheistic like Christianity, like Rome went from being polytheistic with Christianity to monotheistic, just like that, because of this victory. And so Mecca, because he went back to his hometown where Mecca was kind of the center of religion, that's why Mecca today is the most holy site in all of Islam. And so he established this new one God theology over Arabia. And then, of course, he made the decision that we need to take that to the world. The world needs to be in submission to Allah. He died in 632 and then passed his legacy on, and there was a lot of debate about that passage, because in passing that power to the next generation, there were some that wanted Muhammad's relatives to be the new line of power, and then there were others who wanted Muhammad's chief lieutenant to be the power source for the future. And right there in 632, we had the two branches of Islam, the Shia and the Sunnis, who went to war with each other to some degree and are still at war with each other today since 632 AD. It has never ended. Okay? So that's just basically a little summary of history. And of course, the followers of Muhammad did take Islam and decide to conquer the world. And so they immediately rushed in and conquered the Middle East and Africa. Then they went up through Asia and Turkey. And had not there been some assembled Western armies to combat the spread of the Islamic faith, we'd be speaking Arabic today. Okay? They've never stopped the war. The goal is to conquer the world. And that's why you feel the fervor among the Islamic extremists, that we call extremists, but really, I hate to say this, this is not necessarily politically correct, but that extremism goes with Islamic culture. The goal, maybe not in the horrendous jihad that we see today, but in a Muslim's mind, the goal is to conquer the world and bring it all into submission to Allah. Just like Christians, our goal is to evangelize the world. Now, some of their beliefs I've listed there for you. I'm only going to focus on the 5 pillars of the faith. You can read through the beliefs. But when it comes to the 5 pillars of faith, if you were asked, how do I become a Muslim? Here's what they would say. First, you've got to publicly confess the Shahada, which is this statement: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Every Muslim recites that over and over again. You've got to pray 5 times a day, and you do that by getting on your knees, as you see, and pointing towards Mecca, wherever you are in the world, and you pray. Usually they're uniform prayers, not necessarily individual prayers like we pray, but they're praying towards Mecca to Allah 5 times a day. You're required to tithe 2.5% of your income to Islam. You fast during the month of Ramadan, which is the 9th month of the year. And at some point in your life, if you're able, if you're sick, you send a substitute. But at some point in your life, you need to make a pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. It's called the Hajj. Okay, how Islam compares with Christianity. When it comes to God, of course, for Muslims, God is one. And if you read the Quran, you got to remember, the Quran was written in history, so it's got a lot of historical context to it. But in the Quran, it attacks the Trinity of Christianity as blasphemy. But here's what's interesting. Remember, I was telling you that Christianity and Judaism and polytheism was all kind of merged in Arabia, and a little bit confusion as far as the theology. You feel that being stuck in time theology when you read the Quran, because in the Quran, the angel Gabriel is railing against the blasphemy of Christians who believe in the Trinity, and then it tells you, Gabriel tells you who the Trinity is. It's God the Father, God the Son, and Mary. That's who the Trinity is. And you know why? Because in 600 AD, this kind of goes back to Catholicism a little bit, but Mary had been exalted. Just like Mary is exalted in Catholicism today. But what Muhammad heard is that Mary is part of this Trinity. And so in the Quran it says, it's talking about Christians and how they worship 3 gods, and they worship Jesus and God the Father and Mary. But that tells you kind of how they're stuck in the 6th century. I remember when I talked to some Muslim leaders, I brought that up. I said, we don't worship Mary. Oh, yes, you do. Yes, you do. And of course, then they can point to certain Catholic statements where they kind of justify that, but they're convinced. They're convinced. Even if Christians say, we don't, no, we do. Because Gabriel was right. Okay? And by the way, when I was in Israel for a little less than a month, we stayed in a hotel in Nazareth. So we operated out of Nazareth. And when Nazareth is a city today that is mostly Arab. And it's kind of a hot spot for Islamic evangelism. So if you walk the streets of Nazareth, you're going to have young Muslims come up to you with a little Quran, give it to you, and try to evangelize you. But right outside our hotel was this giant billboard on Main Street, just kind of overshadowing the main drive. And on there was a quote from the Quran calling Christians to repent of their blasphemy of 3 gods. And then it had the Quranic verse that was there, because they believe in just one God. And when you believe in Islam, there is no God but Allah, period. No Trinity, none of that. When it comes to man, Muslims believe humans are born with hearts that are clean slates. You're not born sinful. And so the way you become righteous is you become righteous by self-effort. You're called upon by Allah to live a good life, and to live a good life, you've got to live it and discipline yourself to live that good life. When it comes to Jesus, Islam denies that Jesus is the Son of God, but because they accept the Old Testament and New Testament as holy books, they think they've been corrupted, totally corrupted, so only they have the interpretation to the Old and New Testament. But they see Jesus as one of the great prophets. In fact, he's the only sinless prophet. He's probably second only to Muhammad. There are 28 holy prophets in Islam, and Jesus is one of those. But a Muslim, if you want to get in a good conversation with a Muslim, you can talk about Jesus, because they're going to respect Jesus. He's way up there in their pantheon of prophets, and they highly respect who he is. When it comes to salvation, Muslims earn their salvation by believing in Allah and following the 5 pillars of the faith. And no Muslim except martyrs die assured of heaven. When I met with some of the Muslim leaders here in Little Rock, when we were talking about this, one of them kind of joked. He said, "You Christians have it easy. You believe that God's assured you of heaven with His grace." And he said, "We see that as cheap." He said, "We work our way to heaven." And so I asked him, I said, "Well, let me ask you this. Since you're a leader here," I said, "when you die, are you going to heaven?" And he said, "No one makes that decision but Allah. So no, when I die, I won't know until Allah makes the decision. It's Allah's will whether I go to heaven or not." So when it comes to eternity, every person will be resurrected in Islam and judged by Allah at the end. He will be the one to make it. And if you've lived well enough in His eyes, then you will be sent to heaven. If you haven't, you'll be sent to hell. Okay, hang on, guys. We're going to get it all in. Okay, now we're going to turn to Mormonism. Now, in Mormonism, it gets a little, you're going to have to put your thinking cap on, because it gets a little wilder. Okay? Okay, but in Mormonism, you had Joseph Smith, who at 17 experienced a vision with the angel Moroni appearing at his bedside. And that started a relationship where he started to have these revelations. And as time went on, the angel Moroni told Smith of a book that was written on golden plates that contained the fullness of the everlasting gospel. It was kind of the final revelation, if you will. And 4 years later, Smith dug up those plates. He had them in his possession, and he began to translate those plates that ultimately became the Book of Mormon. Now, when he translated those plates, he did so behind a curtain. No one could see him. He had a scribe on the other side of the curtain. He was on the other side with the golden plates, and he would dictate to the scribe what to write, which ultimately became the Book of Mormons that Mormons carry around and come and knock on your door. Okay? Ultimately, the angel either took back the golden plates or they disappeared. They're gone. We've never been able to see them and examine them ourselves. But Smith said he had them in his possession, and the Book of Mormon is the translation of those golden plates. After that, the Book of Mormon was published, and Joseph Smith created quite a following. And then over time, he began to give other revelations that became 2 of the other great books of Mormonism, Doctrines and Covenant and the Pearl of Great Price. Everybody look for a second. The Book of Mormon is much more standard to Christianity in some ways. But when you start getting to his later revelations in Doctrines and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price, then the revelations become more extreme. You begin to talk about baptism of the dead, celestial marriages, those kind of things. And as Smith's followers began to verbalize those things in a rural environment of Missouri and Illinois, it created quite a backlash. And so there began to be actual skirmishes and violence between Mormons and non-Mormons. And then ultimately Smith was put in jail. Then there was a shootout and he was killed. He died in a shootout trying to break him out of jail. There was a period of time where Mormons regrouped, finally selected Brigham Young to be their leader, and then Brigham Young needed to get out of town with his followers, and so they moved to Utah and settled in the wilderness and have built a whole culture out there around Salt Lake City with their temples. So that's kind of the general historical background of how they got to where they are. So now their beliefs. Let's just look at their beliefs. And again, we could spend the whole time talking about their beliefs because it's and some of them it's hard to get your head around some of the things. But in Mormonism, we're not passionately. Sometimes Mormons will use a lot of Christian terms because one of the things driving the Mormon church today is to look mainstream Christian. They want to get along with Christians. They want to be considered a Christian faith as much as they can. So some of their extreme thoughts are kind of pushed to the back closet. Some of their similarities are pushed forward, which leads in their evangelism. But when you take God, for instance, worshiping God the Father, with Mormons, that concept gets skewed because the problem is we're all gods. We're not looking just to become a God, we're all gods. So that's where they make the statement that as God now is, man once was. In other words, man was once this way and he became a God. And as God now is, man will be or can be. He can work his way to being the same God. And so Mormonism is polytheistic in the fullest sense of the word. Human beings have the ability to become their own gods. There are 3 heavens in Mormonism and no hell. There's polygamy, and polygamy is very important, even though legally it's been suppressed in a lot of ways. But the reason polygamy is so important is because children are the key to populating other worlds. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then there's baptism for the dead. I listed in your notes the most bizarre doctrine within Mormonism as it compares to Christianity, and it's called, you might underline it there in your notes, it's called eternal progression. And rather than go through the notes, just look up here and I'll explain to you, here's what eternal progression is all about. We're just going to take, let's say, me and my wife. Okay, here we are on earth, and we are human beings, okay? And our goal is not just to get to heaven. Our goal is to get to the 3rd heaven. So how do we get to the 3rd heaven? Well, we get evangelized by Mormons. We become Mormons. We start practicing the Mormon faith. We go to Salt Lake into the great temple, and we have a celestial marriage that'll seal our marriage in eternity so we can be married after we're dead. When we die, we go to this celestial heaven. And there we can propagate children. Because children aren't born on earth, they're first born in heaven. So they become celestial children. And then, married, those celestial children, we get the privilege of implanting them on some planet in the universe. It becomes our planet. And we're the God, like God the Father is of our planet. We become the God of that planet or that universe. And we put our spirit children on that planet. But when they go to the planet mortal because they're innocent. And during the time they're on that planet, they have the opportunity to earn their way to their own celestial heaven with their own celestial mate, where they can produce their own spirit children and then propagate another universe or another planet. Okay? If they fail in that, they don't go to hell, but they go to a lesser heaven, a celestial heaven or a terrestrial heaven. But no one goes to hell. But the goal of a Mormon is to get to the celestial one and ultimately rule over your own universe. And the prime example of that was Jesus, because he lived this great life. He probably married, you don't hear this a lot, but he probably married in this life, had his own children, took that marriage or multiple wives into a celestial world, and is propagating spirit children underneath the Father who, with his wife, is ruling this world, and ultimately the Father of this world will move on to another planet, and Jesus will rule over this for a period of time. Can you get your head around that? That's eternal progression. Because we're not born on earth, we're born in we're spirit. We come to earth, live well enough to ultimately become our own God with our own planet. That's what eternal progression is all about. So how does Mormonism compare with Christianity? Well, as far as God, everyone can become a God. If you follow Mormon beliefs and practices. When it comes to Jesus, Jesus was once a man. But through obedience, he progressed. See that progression? He progressed to godhood. When it comes to man, God and humans are the same. We're the same species of being, okay? We're the same species of being, just at different points of development. Okay? So Jesus, my brother, okay, he's up there, he's all pro. And I'm just junior high. But we are the same. And if I really live a good life and follow Mormon teachings and stuff like that, ultimately I'll be all pro standing next to Jesus. Okay? And when it comes to salvation, individual salvation is based on works. The better you work, the better you follow Mormon practice and stuff, the higher you go. And when it comes to eternity, as I told you, Mormons believe in 3 heavens. 3 heavens, but no hell. Which then brings us to the last religion that I just call atheism because it's a belief system, and it's pretty obvious about atheism. Atheism kind of became formalized in the 1900s with Darwin and all that, became more formalized, and where it kind of carries science as its sidekick and appeals to science a lot. But here's its beliefs. There is no God or scientific proof of God. Human beings must save themselves. Humanity's chief goal is the development of man and his happiness. The only morality is that which is affirmed by man's reason and experience. That's why in atheism that sometimes impacts what we'd call more liberal ideas or enlightened ideas. We can move from one morality to the next. And we saw that in one of our other questions where we moved from traditional marriage to the new marriage of today to an atheist. That's just man's reason, making morality better and more righteous and better for everybody and bringing more happiness to planet Earth. The big issue is the one I want to mention here at the bottom of the beliefs. Who decides practically what is best and right for humanity becomes those atheists who are the brightest, most persuasive, and most powerful. And you might underline most powerful because sometimes the most powerful atheist is not the brightest. He's just the most powerful. But the goal is still the same, to create this utopia. But to create a utopia where everybody's atheist, you can't have everybody's opinion. You've got to have one opinion. So who decides that? Well, the most powerful. And if bringing in that utopia means eliminating a lot of opposing atheists, you know, the end in mind, that's not a bad thing to do. So we can eliminate those people to get to the end in mind. And that's why wherever atheism has been a dominant philosophical belief system, you have the mass slaughter of millions of people. Because you have to exterminate the opponents. It's got to be one way or the highway. One or the other. That's atheism. And of course, its comparison to Christianity is just simply this. When it comes to God, there is no God. The material world is all there is. When it comes to man, man is good. The only thing holding man back is ignorance or poor social and environmental conditions. The way man is saved is through his mind. Reason is the way man saves himself. When it comes to Jesus, Jesus was a man made famous by myth. And when it comes to eternity, this life is all there is. Okay, guys, believe it or not, we just covered the 7 major religions of the world. which is most of the people in the world, comparing them side by side. So let me just make a few summaries and then we'll be done. But I wanted you to have those notes so you can review them and use them to consult with when you hear things and go, okay, how does that fit with what I just heard? But if we take Christianity and put it side by side with the major religions of the world, it is interesting that Christianity separates itself in some major areas from all of the other religions, because it is different. And here they are, listed in your outline. First of all, in Christianity, believers are saved by faith in Jesus. It's a faith salvation of what He did for us. In all the other religions, in every one of them, you're saved by good works. You've got to work your way to that better place through self-effort. And even when you do, the thing that separates, or even when you work at it, the thing that separates Christianity from the other world religions is that after you've done all that work, in Christianity, you feel secure because your salvation is guaranteed in this life by your leader. He did it for you. But in all the other religions of the world, you do all that work, all that self-effort, and then you die, and you hope that your karma was good enough. If it's not, you're going to wake up as an animal, or a ghost, or another human in another place and start all over. Or if you're a Muslim or a Mormon, you might wake up in a spot you don't want to be in because Allah decided, you worked hard, but you just didn't make it. You didn't make the cut. Your grade was 79 and 80 is the passing grade. Okay? I'm just being honest. There's not an assurance of eternity in that regard. In Christianity is established by a divine leader who rose from the grave after death. All other faiths are established by human leaders who are still in their graves. In Christianity is supported not just by the words of the leader. Jesus didn't go necessarily into a place and come up with a holy book and say, believe this. Jesus, in fact, didn't write anything. Isn't that interesting? He just lived a life that others around him in multiples observed and said, this is what we saw. Jesus, and what they saw was Jesus doing all kinds of good works and miracles and things like that that just amazed people. In fact, that's why one of the great religious leaders of Israel came to Jesus at night and said, no man can do these things that you do unless God is with him. We're just amazed at that. So he supported his statements by the way he lived and the miracles he did. But if you look at other religions, the other religious leaders, one, they didn't have multiple observers. In fact, they were behind a curtain or in a cave dictating, and then they came out and said on their own, believe this, with no supporting evidence. And people did, but there weren't all these miracles to support what was being communicated. It was just mostly, this is it, follow me. Where Jesus said, follow me, and I'm showing you what is it. It also, in Christianity is supported by specific prophecies that detailed with accuracy future events. In most other religions, there are no prophecies at all. Islam actually added some after the fact, as did Mormonism, adding some things with witnesses after Joseph Smith lived that he did some miracles. But during the time, there was none of that supporting evidence. In Christianity, God is a close and personal God that we say lives within us, that we can pray to, that has compassion for us, that we feel is forgiveness and support. In most religions of the world, in fact, all the other religions of the world, either God is totally impersonal, he's that Brahma, that impersonal absolute, or he's like Allah, removed from the world, simply with a face of judgment. You better live good enough. And after life is over, that same Allah makes a very sobered, sterile decision about whether you were or you weren't. So that brings us to final thoughts, and we'll take a break. Letter A, the world's religions are at odds with one another in their primary beliefs and teachings and are therefore irreconcilable. We're not worshiping the same God. We're not on the same path. All religions don't teach the same. between the religions of the world, really, if you look at them, I mean, I wish we could all get together, don't you? But the reality is, if you scratch any beneath the surface, there is no common God, and there's little, if any, common spiritual ground. The great religions are not just different, they are fundamentally opposed to one another. Which brings us to this final statement. When one studies what the great religions actually teach, really you're left with this one conclusion. And the one conclusion is this: either all religions are wrong, it's all just man wanting something bigger than himself, or one is right.